very honored to do this interview with you. You know that my life was changed by the work we did. And I think we met about 10 years ago. So here we go. So the first thing we would like to ask you is, what was the context, the cultural context, the spatial, the chronological context around the time you were conceived?
Again, I appreciate, Maria, you doing this. We've worked together for a long time and feel very honored to be in your presence, to have you leading this process. So we've worked hard together for many things. The context, this was a very surprising thing to me when I looked at that question, or we talked about it, because the culture and the time is very similar to what's going on right now. I was conceived in 1941, born in 1942. I hadn't put together that the same thing that's going on in Ukraine was going on in Ukraine then. It wasn't Putin, it was Stalin and more Hitler. It was a time of World War II. There was the initiation of the Holocaust at that time. In Greece, there was a village that was wiped out during that period of time. Hitler put out his proclamation of terminating the Jewish people in the world. There were thousands of people that were killed and sent to encampments. There were ships being sunk, and I got this when I looked up what happened in 1941, what was happening in 1942. Anne Frank, maybe some of you know the story of Anne Frank, the diary of Anne Frank. She got her diary 2 days after I was born in 1942. That was a surprise to me. So it was a very difficult time for Europe when I was conceived, when I was born. In the United States, we were impacted by so many immigrants having families in Europe and other places, Japan. Pearl Harbor happened when I was in utero. So it was a very difficult time in culture. My dad ran what was called Kinray Manufacturing, which was a screw machine company that produced parts and things for the war. And my mother, at that time, had one child that was 2.5 years younger than I am. So it was after the Depression had ended, to pretty much, and it was but a very stressful time for many people. We didn't have the internet describing all the different kinds of things that were happening. So people got their news like at movie theaters or newspapers. And I remember as a young child going to movie theaters and seeing the movies of what was happening in the World War that were being sent back at a very young age. I can remember seeing that on the screens because my parents dragged me to the movies. I don't think they were movies I wanted to go to, but they took me to the movies so they could go to the movies when I was very, very young. So it was a difficult time for the world. It wasn't such a difficult time in the sense of my family. There was stress. We had some relatives that went into the military for the war. And a couple of them came back wounded, but that was a little bit after I was born. So that was kind of the culture. my parents were, it was a white, middle class, somewhat affluent community, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon. So in some ways, I was born into a position of what we would call privilege, into the right side of things. And you didn't realize that at the time, but so this was an interesting thing to go back and look at that and see the similarities to what was happening now. On the positive side, penicillin began during the time, and its use during the time when I was in utero. Bob Feller, one of my favorite baseball players, threw a no-hitter on opening day when I was in utero. Never had happened in the Major League Baseball team. Joe DiMaggio had his 56 hitting streak. So, and my dad and my grandfather were rabid baseball fans. And one of several of the players, but one significant player, one of the greatest players of the game in the history, Ted Williams, actually quit playing baseball to train flyers in the military, in the Marines, in 1942 in World War II. So it was a tumultuous time for people, and especially for your people in your countries in Europe. For Ilza, it was just before I was conceived. I didn't realize this, but just before I was conceived was when the first people from Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were sent to Siberia by Stalin. And I have a picture of a place there that commemorates where the people were loaded onto boxcars. There was another deportation as well. But that was interesting in terms of the culture that I came into.
So you mentioned some, but maybe we go over it more in detail if you have anything to add. What would you say were some values, the main values, or opportunities, or challenges that this period around your conception offered?
Well, there are pluses and minuses to that. I was an unplanned, unwanted child. I didn't know that at the time. I know now I had that sensation within my body and that cellular memory in my body. My mom told me that story when I was 22 years old. That's when I discovered it cognitively. She said that she didn't want to have another child. She had one child, and that's all she wanted. And she didn't want me, and she didn't plan to have me, but it happened. And she did say afterwards she loved me. And I didn't, when she told me that, the reason she was telling me that at 22 is my mom and dad were going through a divorce. And my dad's grandmother, my mother was afraid my dad's mother would tell me the story and I would be on his side instead of her side. So she wasn't telling it to heal it. She wasn't telling it to help me out. She was doing it to save her own skin, actually, which is part of what my role became as in life. I became aware later, 25 years later, I began to realize what that meant, because at 22, I just sloughed it off. She had said, no woman wants to have another baby after they've had a first baby. Well, I didn't know any different. I was 22. I probably should have, but I never questioned that. Many women wanted to have more babies, but I didn't know that at that time. I just said, oh, it's okay. But I didn't realize until 25 years later when I met Eva Reich and started to work with the in utero memories. She had a way of working with those and called metamorphosis. And when I went through that, only then did I understand how that totally impacted my life for all of my life. Because I was always trying to stay in the place where I was born. If I went away, I needed to come back there. I had built a vacation home in Youngstown, Ohio. No one does that. It'd be like building a vacation home in the center of downtown Athens. You don't do that. You go to vacations on the islands or at the sea. But I did. It became the place where we lived. That very much impacted my life. And my sense as I look back on it, I was always afraid. And the thing that has, in a sense, haunted me all of my life was every place I go into, whether it's doing this, whether it's teaching a group, whether it's a party, whether it's a relationship, I'm always anticipating or anxious that I'm not wanted there. It's a bioenergetic response. In my head, it doesn't make sense. But in my body, it's that sense of I'm kind of looking around what's going on. Is it safe to be here? Am I wanted? Or is somebody going to try and get rid of me? So those are, it's a plus and a minus. I was born into a pretty good space, but at the same time, I came into a place that emotionally, there was no connection. I was not wanted, planned. There was no bonding, attachment. There wasn't any connection. And later on in talking to some of my aunts, I only had 2 aunts, so I couldn't go back and ask Mom this when I found out what I learned. My sister said that my mother was depressed during the birth, and she was depressed after the birth, and that my grandmother, her mother, was very afraid. I think she was afraid she was going to kill herself. She was so depressed because she was out there trying to help and take care of things. So I also in some ways spent a lifetime trying to prove that I was okay, trying to prove that I should be wanted, trying to prove that I had value. And that's hard to do. I tried to prove to my mother that men were okay. Not successful. She had a lot of fear of men, and I was a man. I was a boy. So that was another strike in a difficult situation. So that I think was the biggest impact of my life. The birth, there was a lot of anesthetic in the birth, and I think my breathing processes were affected in that use of the anesthetic at birth. Okay, so maybe you want to add something to that.
So if we take it on outside the personal level, the social times around your conception, were there any values or any opportunities around what you already described around what was going on historically around that time that you would talk about?
As I said, I came into a system where I had a lot of privilege. I grew up in a family that was very prejudiced. It was prejudiced against Catholics. There was a lot of prejudice against Jewish people. There was the farmers. They're just farmers. The rich people, well, they're just rich because they did something to get that way. People of color, was prejudice against that. People who spoke native languages, they had names for those people. The people who still spoke in their language from Poland or Hungary or something like that. I can remember going downtown shopping and hearing them speak that. I was curious. It sounded kind of interesting. And the response was, oh, those are just fill in the blank. It wasn't a very nice response. I got to the point when I was a little bit older that I kind of thought, I don't think there was anybody that was okay except my mother and my grandmother. They were the only two people that were okay. And if you asked one or the other of them, I'm not sure they would say one or the other of them was okay. My dad was also very prejudiced. I can remember as a young man going to Washington Dulles Airport when it first opened. I was probably college age. I was a little bit older than youth, but it's what I lived with in that family. And it's a big argument about how it was the white European Anglo-Saxons that really did such great things in the world. And no matter what I said about African cultures or other people, that was very difficult to overcome. I didn't believe what they said, but it was like they would not. Who am I that they would listen to me? The only exception to that was my grandfather. He was called Rocky. It was his nickname, Rocky, and I liked his nickname. So I started calling him that too. My cousin made it up because he couldn't pronounce Roy, so he called him Rocky. And he was a hat salesman in downtown Youngstown. Youngstown was a steel mill. It was the city I was born in. It was a center for the mafia. The mafia from New York and Chicago met there to settle issues. And so it was a mafia center at that time. And very prominent sports center. In fact, I was told that my grandfather, I didn't know this at the time as a child. I learned it later in life. He was dead. I couldn't talk to him about it. But I didn't think he was very athletic. But I understand that the Pittsburgh Pirates, a baseball team, was interested in him as a professional catcher. They wanted to sign him. But he had some kind of problem in a game one time, and he hit some other player with a bat, and he quit. He was so frightened of his own anger that he quit playing baseball. And when he would play with me, he would throw the ball up with one hand and hit it one-handed. And I thought, you're not supposed to do it that way. You're supposed to have two hands to hit the ball. And but he could hit it over my head with one hand. I didn't think about that. I just thought he wasn't doing it right. And I thought my dad was the better athlete, but I don't think he was. I think my grandfather was, but I missed not being athletic. But what I was getting at was that I think as a result of playing sports, he met Black people, he met Italian people, he met people from all walks of life. He met Catholic people, Jewish people. And is selling hats. He sold hats to everybody. He sold hats to the mafia bosses. He sold hats to Black people. That was one thing that they were proud of. That's when people wore those hats that they don't wear anymore. It was part of the culture of the 1940s, 1950s. And, but he, I think, is the one that I learned that all people have something to offer. All people should be treated with respect and important. And I think in playing sports with them, he developed that and make friends with them. Not just playing sport, he made friends with them. And I think that's where some of that came from, that more openness to people and to life. And that was enhanced for me when I started traveling around the world. And I began to find out a whole lot more about that. So some of the other things that probably happened when I was a child that maybe came from my parents that were of value. My parents played. They encouraged us to play, to go swimming, to play sports. My mom took me to dance lessons. I didn't really want to go there. I wanted to play baseball or football or basketball, but I was forced to go to ballroom dancing. It was kind of nice to be able to do that later in life, but it's not what I wanted to do at 12 or 13 years old. I was pushed. So there was that positive of I got a lot of experiences, got to do a lot of things, but it wasn't always what I wanted to do. It was what my mother thought was best for me to do in life. And it was kind of living a life out for her. Not exactly really healthy. So my dad, some of the things I learned from him that became significant in life was he could do a lot of different kinds of things. He could work at taking people out to a formal dinner to entertain them to sell products. He could also go into the factory and make the products. So he had a wide range of skills, and he could fix things and he could build things. And I worked with him in some of that. I never developed his skill to fix cars, but I developed some of his skills to do carpentry work and to repair things and to try to have that mindset of if something's not working, to try to figure it out as to what's going on. And that, I think, contributed in part to therapy. He was an engineer, and I was studying to be an engineer. Mathematics was my strength, and science. And I don't do therapy from a prose. Reading's difficult for me. I had dyslexia. But I learned to do working with people in therapy from a mathematical concept and from a scientific concept of exploration, observation, and hypothesis, and figuring out what's going on with the person, rather than bringing something to impose on them that this is how it ought to be, because I couldn't read the books anyway. So I learned from the people. And I think in part that's some of the things I got from the family I grew up in, being somewhat creative in that way. So other questions?
So is there any significant story that you can narrate for us from your childhood that you think can relate to who you became later in life?
I think actually the most significant story is the conception. That's the one that's overriding. The stories from when I was a child, not so many. I can remember one story from when I was in the 6th grade. Teacher called me in, and we only had one black girl in our whole class. And I had asked her to dance when we had dance groups. I danced with her. I considered her a friend. I gave her some of the coloring things that I had. I thought she was a really nice kid. And she had told the teacher that I said something racially about her. And I had no idea that I had said anything. I just told the teacher, I can't say anything. I don't know. And the teacher said something about, if you lie to me, I'll beat you if I find out afterwards you lied. So I went out to the playground, and my friend, she had also talked to him, and my girls out. I said, why'd you say that to the teacher? And my friend said, well, we did say something. I said, what did we say? And we, kidding back and forth with each other, had said a couple of terms that all of a sudden I realized, oh, I didn't know that's what that meant. That it was a derogatory term. It wasn't the usual derogatory term, it was something different. But it was something that wasn't appropriate at the time. But what I was aware of was I couldn't go back to the teacher and tell her that. She didn't leave me any avenue to go back and tell her, because she said if I find out that, she was going to hurt me. And I wasn't about to go back and tell her something and have her beat me. And I was stuck with that. And I think that was very significant for me in thinking about language and trust and saying appropriate things, and also about how you correct kids, how you work to change kids when stuff like that happens that they're not aware of, and to educate them rather than to threaten to harm them in that setting. So, and I think that probably contributed to how I approach therapy when I work with people, is to listen and observe what somebody's saying and the context and their story, and see what can be done with that. So that was one. And the other stuff is, I guess, kind of a little bit later in life. When I was in high school, there was a man in high school that was involved in a church group. We had a retreat, and it was really nice. It was at a camp, and Wayne Alt was his name, and he was leading a kind of a Vesper or a meditation kind of thing in what we call the Chapel of the Pines, like big pine forest, and it was kind of isolated up on a side of a hill. And he had a garbage can up there. And he was raising the question of, are we seeking the things that are valuable in life, or are we seeking out what's the trash? Are we looking for the meat of life, or are we looking for the scraps? That's basically all he said. And walking down the hill, it was like a transformation for me. It was like a rebirth experience of something happened. And it felt like my whole life changed. And my value system changed. And I began to think about what I wanted to change within my life and what I wanted to be like. And it was an inner, spontaneous, life-changing experience for me that I remember back. This was when I was 16 years old, I think. And so those are a couple of things.
You may have talked about this a bit, but I'm going to ask it in another way. Maybe something else will come up. If you can speak about some initial traits of yours that have guided you to the direction you took later on in life, like you would say, or if you have anything else to add, as you've already talked about some of this.
Well, I think the trait from my grandfather of accepting all people in sports was one. I think that the experiences that I think with my dad, my dad was an alcoholic, and I can remember having to go down and pick him up from his work. As I had to be around 6 years old, maybe younger. And he was drunk and he couldn't get home. And I drove down with my mother to get, because she didn't want to leave me alone, I guess, and to get him in the car and get him home. And he went in and slept on the couch till he got sober. And I think in part as a result, I didn't like to drink. For one thing, it didn't taste good to me. But secondly, I saw how that impacted my life. He was not available to be involved in a deep relationship. He kind of abandoned me to my mother, and my mother tried to shape me into a man or boy that would be what a woman would want. It was not so nice. It was very naive. It's like, so I think that was significant for me because I'd never been a drinker in my life. And I think that probably the genes are in that if I would have, I might have also become an alcoholic. But I rejected that kind of lifestyle as being necessary to do things. And I think the choosing to figure out what's really important in life instead of going after the garbage was probably significant in terms of becoming a therapist and working with people to figure out what it is they really want in life instead of what I think they ought to want or how they ought to be. And that may be the opposite pole of what my mother was. My mother wanted me to be what she wanted me to be. And I think a lot of people suffer from that, of people brainwashing them to think and be what they want children to be instead of allowing the child to teach them and becoming what they want to be. I think children who come into our world and into our paths have the two possibilities. One is we can destroy them, or we can allow them to help us heal our experiences that we didn't get a chance to heal when we were a child. And I think the latter is a better way to go. I think many parents want to kind of beat their child down and make the child into what they want them to be instead of allowing the child to teach them and help them to heal their processes. I've probably learned more from my kids than I've ever taught them, being open to that. And it's also a trait that I've taught, that I teach therapists. I tell anybody that's in my training programs, if you will approach your work, that the people you encounter will teach you far more about life than you will ever teach them. You will be a lot better therapist. And you'll also learn something. And they will have a chance then to figure out their life in relationship to being involved with you. So I think part of that comes from that. It was a negative experience. Out of it is some positive stuff comes. I think there might be an easier way to do that than what I went through. But again, one therapist said to me, she said, "Were your parents abusive?" And I said, "No, it was a good family," in quotes, and they had a lot of stuff. She said, and she surprisingly said, "Well, just because it was in quotes a good family doesn't mean you weren't abused." And that again has stuck with me for 40 years of realizing that abuse is not necessarily because somebody physically harms you, or not necessarily because it isn't overall pretty good. It's something different as you work with it. So. Other questions?
What would you say were the main inspirators for your life? The people that ignited the spark for the work that you later did, or not only people, maybe they were not human inspirations.
Not human. Okay. Well, I would say they were all human, but I may have to rethink about that. I think I think my grandfather, and I've talked about him already, was that. I probably wouldn't list my mom and dad in that category. I think I would list a man that I encountered in my seminary training. Well, maybe first a teacher that I had that was a teacher of child psychology, Mrs. Fulcomer. And I had her at university. It was a good university, Westminster, but she was a teacher that was a teacher there. I don't know that she even had a doctorate, but she was the best teacher I had in child psychology and adolescent psychology. And she taught it from a practical standpoint. And she had us do a child study. And so I went out and did this child study with one of my, was a young child. He was about under 5 or 6 years old. His brother was a year older. And it was one of the most fascinating things I'd ever done in life of doing this study of how he had developed and gotten to where he was, and really fascinating, talented kid. And that was a big influence on me in terms of thinking about children and the child's beginnings and how they impacted their life throughout life. That was one. The other one was in seminary, where I had this man, his name was Dr. Albeck. It was at a Lutheran seminary. I was an American Baptist minister. And I'll say American Baptist because we carried Martin Luther King's credentials when no one else would. We were a very progressive, open community, and compared to some other Baptist groups in the world. And so I was attending a Lutheran seminary, and he said to me, "There's no reason in you learning about Lutheran worship. You're an American Baptist. There's no reason for you to learn Lutheran church history in the United States or to learn about Lutheran confessions. He said, you write your professors in your seminaries and you find out the books that they use. And you get the books. And you and I will sit down together. That was the first thing. We'll sit down together. He was going to sit with me. This was a guy that was well known in the United States as the most knowledgeable historian in the Lutheran Church of that time in the United States. Very well respected. And I thought, he's going to sit with me, a student. And the other thing he said was, in that way, I'll learn something and you'll learn something. And he's going to learn something from me. And that was the first part of it. And that's a principle that I've said before that I've carried in life is you can learn from anybody. If you'll approach that they have something to teach you, you can understand it. The second thing that he said, one course, he gave me a list of readings, and I did the readings, and we came back together, and he asked me a question, and I answered the question. And he said, well, where did you get that? Where did you get that idea? And I said, well, it was in the readings that you had me do. And he said, what reading? And I told him the guy, and he said, okay. He said, I know that man. He's a very good scholar. He's a very good man. But is what he says true? And I thought, you can ask that question? You can ask, is what somebody writes and says, who's a scholar, who's well known, is true? I can ask, is what you say true? And it changed my whole way of thinking. It's this sense of, you can ask, is it really true? Now, that's not really popular in so many circles, because I found when I heard something and I would say, that's just not true, people would get angry with me. It could be not factually true, but if I called them on it, or I said one of their gurus was saying something that wasn't true about women or about children or stuff, it was a great sin to say that, to question something. It was kind of like my mother. You're not supposed to question. Or my dad. You're not supposed to question. And I started to live my life out that way. And then I started to apply that to clients as well. When I got into doing therapy with people. Well, where did you learn that? He told me. And I might say, I don't think that's true. People came to me with messages, well, I'm not very smart. And I said, where'd you learn that? Well, Dad told me that. I said, I don't think that's true. In fact, based on the fact that your dad has a college degree, your mother has a college degree, I'm guessing that you're probably very smart. That's the way it is. And so that's a principle that I apply in all in therapy. If somebody says something, I say, is that true, or is that brainwashing? And Eva Reich, my mentor, was brainwashed herself, and she would always say, this is brainwashing, or she would say to me, that's brainwashing. Or other people might say that to me, that's brainwashing, that's not true. Going a little further with that, I had a golf teacher, his name was Paul McMullen, and we were hitting golf balls, and he was a professional, and I said, well, I can't hit it as far as you. I'm smaller. I'm little. Because that's what my mom had always said to me. You're little. You're small. You're too small. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I realized I was taller than he was. And all of a sudden, I realized it's not because I'm little. It's because I had this mindset in myself that I bought into, that I agreed to. So in my process of working with people, I always, not always, but I often question, is that really true? Or is that something you just learned that somebody told you was true that's not really true? And many women in relationships have difficulty, many men in relationships have difficulty because they're carrying messages from their past into the present that are not true, that are inaccurate. And that exists everywhere in the world, about women and men and so forth. Another really significant person for me was Ed Perkinson. I didn't last in the ministry. I wasn't a politician and I wasn't an administrator. I tell people now that I'm not an organizer. I told that to Olga. I'm not an organizer. I'm not a promoter. I'm a teacher and a therapist. I know how to do that. I don't get tired doing that. I could do that all day long. And I don't get tired. Yeah, I might want to go eat sometimes or get some sleep, but that's not exhausting to me. What's exhausting is trying to do things on a computer and organize programs, organize structures, stuff like that. That's tired. Trying to sell myself to people. That's exhausting. But doing that. So I think to be a minister or a leader of a church, you have to be a politician and you have to be an administrator. And I didn't know that. I like preaching sermons and I like working with kids and I like working with people. But I didn't last because of that. And probably in part I didn't last because there's a lot of people in the church or in any organization, you work in an organization as a leader, they don't like you. They're going to say unkind things about you. And if you have this issue of not being wanted and not being planned, you're going to run into that a lot in that kind of a system. And I couldn't handle that. For me, that was too difficult. I didn't want to do that. And so I left. I went into the therapy realm. And that just happened. My wife was all upset because we left the church ministry and she went to a counselor. And the counselor was leaving her job. So I applied for her job. And that's something maybe I could do. It's therapy because I like doing that. I got the job. I was surprised. The counselor actually told the boss, I think he'd be good. It's not about mental illness or anything that they've got problems or his wife was here. It's about an adjustment to what had happened in our lives. And so he was looking for somebody who could do children's programs as well as therapy with people. And I like this therapy idea. So I went and got training in transactional analysis with Ed Perkinson. I went to Case Western Reserve University where he was teaching a course. And then I got into a year-long training program with him. And he was so creative. When I worked with him, I'd go to supervision and I'd describe what was happening. I'd, give me an idea of something to do, an exercise to do with a person. And finally, he had all kinds of exercises. Finally, he said to me, I'll tell you what to do. But he said, what I want you to know is eventually you're going to get to the point in working with people, you're not going to need me to tell you what to do. You'll create it out of your work with the person on the spot as you listen to them. And I thought, wow, I can do what he does. And it was like permission to do that. And one of the other things is he got into this body work therapy, Reichian therapy. They called it radix, then the side he got into. And he came back one time to our supervision. He said, I want to play this tape for you of my work because I want to put together a program you might be interested. So I listened to the tape. And my first reaction was, you're crazy. What have you gotten yourself into? Because he was screaming, hollering, and I'm thinking, it sounded like he was nuts. And because I was all in my head. And so, but what I saw was his life changed. His body structure changed over time. He softened. And he was a different person. And I saw that. I observed that. It's part of what I learned, I think, through life was also to observe, because I couldn't read, so I had to figure things out by watching and seeing and listening. And so I told him, I said, if I worked with you in transactional analysis and Gestalt, I said, I think I could stay a step ahead of you. I'd be always figuring everything out ahead of you. So I think I couldn't do that with this new stuff you're into. So I think I'd like to try that with you. He said, that makes sense. So I worked a long time with him in that. And one of the things that he said to me in the process of that was, Dick, make your world bigger. Because at that time, I was still living within 20 minutes of where I was born. And so that stuck in my head. And I love training with him. And then one day, I had ended a relationship with a woman that had gotten very close to. I bonded with her. She's the only woman I ever bonded to up to that time. And I'd bonded to my 3 daughters, but not my wife, and not other people I'd been involved with before. But I did this woman. It was a very unlikely person to bond to. She smoked, she drank. I didn't do any of those things. But we had a lot of other things we shared, and there was an energetic connection, very deep for me, and for her too. But we never had an exclusive contract, and she was involved with somebody else, and she chose to go that direction. And that was crushing. I went into a very deep grief kind of process. People said to me, well, there's so many more women out there. Why don't you just go find somebody else? And even my therapist said that they had no understanding of attachment and bonding and what that was like in a relationship. And so I went to a therapist, my therapist, and at one point I felt like my head was an eggshell. It was like, just felt like an egg. And her summation was, that sounds like a birth memory. Let's do a meditation visualization of your birth. I said, okay. She was very good. So I said, okay, I'll risk that. So she's sitting there and she's describing to me with my eyes closed what my birth was like. It was beautiful. She was having a beautiful time with it. And she was describing it to me. It was a beautiful experience, a wonderful experience. I wish it would have been my birth. But it wasn't. And I felt like I didn't go anywhere with it. It was just like, it doesn't have anything to do with me. I never stopped her because she was having so much fun with it and it was beautiful, but it had nothing to do with me. It wasn't my experience. And so when it was over, the one good thing that came out of it was she said to me, if you ever get a chance to go and experience Eva Reich's psychodrama birth, do it. Went back home. In my mailbox was a flyer, an Eva Reich workshop. It was going to happen pretty close to where I was. I'd gotten them before, but I'd ignored them. The date to send in the registration had already gone by. I'd just gotten it, but it had already gone by. So I called the guy and I said, can we come? Another friend wanted to come, and he said, sure. We got our stuff out late. I said, well, that sounds like me. I get things out late, so can we still come? And I said, I had one other question. Because in the Reichian work I had done, and a lot of other Reichian work, people worked in their underwear or sometimes naked. And I thought the friend who wanted to go in Ohio is not going to be very comfortable with that. And I said that to her. He said, don't worry about it. Your friend, she'll feel very comfortable because we don't work. Eva Reich does not work that way. And Eva Reich had made a decision. She didn't want to work that way because she didn't think it was right for the client to be undressed and the therapist to be dressed. So she never worked that way. But that's the reason anyway. So went there. And when we went around for the introductions, I told Eva that I had been a minister. And she said, well, did you leave your faith? And I said, no, but I don't go to church. I haven't found a place that I feel at home. I don't care about that, she said. She had studied healing prayer with Agnes Sanford and Jimmy Carter's sister, Ruth Carter Stapleton, President Jimmy Carter. And she said she had become a Christian later in life. When she died, she said, I think I'm a Christian Buddhist. But healing prayer was a very important part of her process. So that kind of brought us together in that. And then I watched her work. And I'd spent 9 years in a family service association. I'd studied therapy. I'd seen so many different models: family systems theory, Gestalt, transactional analysis, reality therapy, behavioral therapies, all different kinds. And so I could pretty well tell what a therapist was going to do next from those models. When I watched Eva work, I never knew what she was going to do next. It was like she sat down next to somebody. She just sat there, didn't do anything. And a tear started to come down the person's eyes. You didn't do anything. You didn't touch her. Where'd that come from? Or somebody would curl up like a little baby. You didn't say anything. You didn't touch her. You didn't do anything. Where'd that come from? And it was kind of like magically she was reaching down inside to work from inside the person, rather than bringing some exercise or fixed thing that one should do to get one into memories or emotions or sensations. And I thought, wow. And she had some tools. And I thought the key was in her tools at that time. I went back and started to use her tools, and I thought, this is the key. They're magical, and they are. They're very powerful. They work very quickly. I had dramatic results in working with her. But the thing that I realized many years later, the key thing that I was seeing was Eva was observing with her eyes, her ears, her smell, her sense of how the person was stopping themselves from their energetic flow. And that she saw herself as working equally together with them. She didn't like dependency on therapists. She didn't like the therapist up here and the client down here. It was like, and she would say to people, we're in this together. Let's see if we can figure out what's happening for you and where it came from. And then see if we can figure out how you can open yourself up to be where you want to be. And that's what I think I was seeing. And it took me a long time. I started doing this in 1985, and I would say I got much clearer on this maybe 20 years later, maybe longer than that later, of beginning to see it's not the tools, it's the process. And so long answer to a question, but Eva Reich became probably the fundamental person for now, at least. And my part in life at this point has been to preserve the work that she did in her life so it can be shared with others. That's my pioneer work. It's not what I've invented, but it's what Eva developed from her father, Wilhelm Reich, to help people. So maybe you have other questions in relation to that, or.
So most of them you've beautifully woven into. So I'll just go through them in case you have some additions, or maybe we've missed something. So anything else you would like to share from your early professional times or research times? Or you want to add?
I think the only thing that I would say is that I'm not a researcher. My research, and Eva had the same principle. She said there's a number of different kinds of research. There's research that is blind study research, where you have two different groups and then you can compare and figure out which is the best or which works. And she said that isn't how she learned to do research. She learned to do research more from an anecdotal kind of process, from research from the standing of what happens to people. And that was the process for me of what happens to people, what works for people. In the beginning, when I was learning TA and Gestalt, that seemed to me to work best for me as I worked with people. There were other ways. And sometimes people who didn't want to work the way I worked, I helped them to find a way to work with somebody else. But then I met Eva, and that became the primary way I worked, and I integrated stuff from transactional analysis and Gestalt. I still do that. There are other models, but I have a basic model, a basic framework. And so it's the learning is, I've learned from the people that I've worked with. I had a grandmother, African-American Black grandmother. Doctor next door had referred her to me, said, could you work with her? She only has a 7th or 8th grade education. Can you work with her? I said, sure, let's see what happens. Now, professionals had told me this kind of thing I do, this gentle bioenergetics, right? It's only for sophisticated people. It's only for college educated people to understand it. Here comes this Black grandmother having a little bit of problems with her grandson. Comes in to see me and says, and I said, okay, this is how I work. And I explained it to her, what gentle bioenergetics is. 2 minutes. And she said, and I asked her, is this interest to you? Would you like to work with me? And she said, I'm tired of all that talk stuff. Let's work with some of the body stuff and some of my stories and memories. And I learned more from that grandmother who didn't even have a high school education. I learned about life, about how she lived and how she made it through life. And a lot of skills. I think if she'd had the opportunity, she probably could have gotten a doctorate degree. She didn't have that opportunity. Well, I learned a lot from her. So that's kind of my research. That's kind of how this developed, and it keeps developing for me as I go along. I keep learning more as I work with people. This experience was very meaningful to me. I didn't realize there were people out there besides, we do a trauma lifeline as one of the things I teach people about, but it's basically focusing on the traumas people have, not the other things that go on. But I didn't really realize there was a whole group of people asking, what do you know about your conception? Because that's the first question we ask somebody. What do you know about your conception? And what was going on with mom and dad during that time? And wanted, unwanted, all the different kinds of things that can be problems for people. That's where we begin. And even believe that was the foundation. And so that's kind of where I began, and then evolved into working with that. So this has been a very interesting process for me, is looking through some of the questions you sent me and thinking about those, and in terms of my own story, my own personal life, and my whole process is people need to do their own work to be involved in this stuff. Some people think you have to have a doctorate degree to be a therapist. Frankly, I think that's a bunch of bullshit, because I have seen people who have doctorate degrees in psychology and they're lousy therapists. And I've seen people who watch people, one of the Gestalt people, he had a degree, but it was in economics. He is one of the best Gestalt therapists ever. And he demonstrated that, I think it was at Stanford University. They laughed because he was going to come there. How would he know anything about therapy until they watched him work? And I think there are two ways to learn to work. You can go to university, get a degree, and learn from books, or you can learn from people. And people will tell you. After all, that's how the people wrote these books, as they worked with people and they came up with ideas to write them. Probably not out of their head, but out of their work with people. So, yeah, that's kind of, from my beginning work, was always open to change and observe. And it comes, I think, from observation. My son-in-law had a sermon a couple weeks ago, and he talked about Sherlock Holmes. Do you know Sherlock Holmes? And Sherlock Holmes, famous detective who, many movies about him, who solves mysteries. But the way he solves mysteries is by observing. He has the capacity to see things that other people don't see, and then to form a hypothesis and then check it out. I think that's what makes good therapy, is you observe, you listen, you see, and that's what's happened in my life. And then you check it out to see if it's true. But you learn to observe people. Even I was talking about watch like a hawk. Just watch. Don't have preconceived ideas as you work with people. An idea of how it ought to go. It goes how it goes. We're not going to have perfect people, perfect therapists. Wilhelm Reich wanted to develop perfect mothers. Eva said, we're not going to be perfect. Get over it. It's not going to happen. Want to develop perfect mothers so you'd have perfect babies. Eva said, no, not going to happen. So, further?
You have talked about the people that you worked with. I just want to ask you if you have anybody to add. So anybody else important that you have worked with and grew together in your work?
Those are probably the most important people. I learn a lot from my granddaughter. She's my teacher. But I learned a lot from her when she was under 5 years old. One night she said to me, Grandpa, she was ready to go to bed. Don't you know that if you're mean, people aren't going to like you? And I thought, uh-oh, because what she was really saying is, you've been mean to me. But she said when she finished it, I still like you, but I'm going to like you. And I thought, okay, that's something I needed to learn from her. And sometimes if I get angry, I may have to think about how I'm expressing that. I get angry, but it was like she saw it as being mean. And so anybody can be your teacher if you'll allow them to teach you. You'll learn stuff as you watch them. So I think that's can't really think of anyone else at this point that I would put in that category. My sister made some contributions to me, I think, when I was younger, in the sense that I would wake up in the middle of the night with my mom and dad arguing. My dad would probably been drinking. My mother didn't know enough to keep her mouth shut when he had been drinking, and they would end up in these great big arguments. I don't think there was violence and attempts at hurting each other. My dad sometimes would throw something or break something. But I woke up in the middle of the night, sitting at the top of the stairs, listening to them scream and holler at each other and crying. And my sister sometimes would intervene and say, you two need to stop it. He's crying. So that was impactful for her to intervene. She was also the one when I was making a speech that said, when we were talking about people of courage, because my topic was courage. And she said, okay, here's some people. She was helping me with the speech. Madam Curry. No, not Madam Curry. Mother Teresa. I'm sorry, Mother Teresa. Franklin D. Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. And there was some Gandhi. There were some others that she mentioned who were people of courage. Different spiritual faiths, different religions, different cultures, different races, different political systems. And I thought, wow, that was important to me to hear her. And that also became part of my sense of differentiating with what people share versus not wanting to try to put them in a box for who they are and what they are. I learned a lot of that by traveling around the world and teaching. I've learned the great values of many people's spiritual lives. We teach a healing prayer as part of the process sometimes in Eva Reich workshop, because Eva said sometimes what we've got is way beyond the realm of psychotherapy. There's not enough time. What's happened to people is too much. So sometimes she would just say, would you like us to say a healing prayer? But in my groups, I've had Buddhist prayers, I've had Hindu prayers, I've had Muslim prayers, I've had Christian prayers, and there is no one way to pray for healing. I've had Wiccans pray for healing for people in a group. One lady was a Wiccan. And people just from a natural perspective of just placing hands on. So, yeah, maybe that's enough of that one.
What would you say are the most important messages that you would like to share with the young generation?
Do a better job than we've done would be one of them. Learn to work cooperatively rather than competitively. Do your own work. No one's ever arrived. There are therapists, there are gurus who say, I've arrived, be like me, and I would walk away from them right away. There are none of those. There's a fellow that created a song in Guru is Guru, simply meaning you're your own guru. They have things to share. There's people that have gifts. I'm not denying that. What you're your own guru. Be your own guru and do your own work. And be open to learning from everybody, anybody. I think that's probably the most important thing that I could offer for people.
Would it be anything different that you would like to send as a message to parents or to
Anything different? What?
Professionals? The same important messages that you would want to send off to parents?
Basically the same thing. I don't often distinguish too much between lay people and professionals. Professionals have some skills, maybe in a specific area, but lay people can have some gifts and skills as well. They're not limited. And I would say, let your child teach you. Don't have anticipations of what your child ought to be like. Explore and discover from within them what they want to do, and not buy into what society thinks or religion thinks or grandparents think is the way they ought to be. Encourage healthy emotional expression, and find ways that can increase the energetic flow of the kids in their life. I think the family should be a bastion of support for the child. The child should not take over the role of the teachers in the school. The family should not take over the role of the police. Now, I'm talking in an ideal situation. There are exceptions where people have to figure out what they need to do. Sometimes children have some problems that we difficulty solve. And I've read a story about one little boy he has a lot of birth trauma. I don't know if anybody ever addressed it, but I also know the things he needed some structure, he needed some help, and no one was providing it. And it was beyond mom's capabilities to do that, and the society was not helping her. I do believe it takes a community to raise children. I agree with that statement. And I grew up in that in a way. That was maybe one of the positive things. We did have a community. The teachers and the parents communicated in the community. My friend was driving his car rather recklessly. Got a phone call from his dad. You either drive that car right or you're going to bring it home and put it in the garage and I'm going to sell it. How does dad know? The neighbor. Who were on the neighbor, the two boys were on the same basketball team. The neighbor saw him driving. He called his dad called him. That's a community that says we as a community will monitor what's happening with our children and will support one another in that. I think it takes a community. And Um, I think with what's happening, particularly in Europe right now, in Ukraine, Poland, other parts of that area, Baltics, other of the Balkan countries and stuff, there's going to be a lot of people that need help, need support from the community. There's babies that have been born in this time, a lot of trauma for them. People are getting pregnant. They're destroying the country. I don't understand the rationale of any of this. But there's a lot of work for people like you, me, to engage in whatever way we can. Sometimes it's overwhelming in thinking of what can I do as an individual, and sometimes it's not much. But we can only do what we can do. And to help people that we come in contact with and to perpetuate that among other people. But there's going to be a lot of trauma. Eva saw a lot of trauma when she came to Europe and worked, different than what you see in the United States because they weren't directly involved. Very different. The traumas are different. The basic principles that we do are the same, but they're different. And there's going to be a lot of people that if you work with people in groups or individuals that and younger generation are going to see this for generations. This is not just this year. This is not just this generation. It's going to be the next generation too, and the one after that. It's really hard to observe that and see it. So other one?
Bit of a fun question. What would life be like if you were not born?
Well, it could be the world would be a better place. It's also possible that Eva Reich's book might not have been put together. No one else was really working to do that or try to preserve her processes. So maybe that wouldn't have happened. I think the other thing is my daughters would not have been born as they were. And I think they've contributed probably more to the world than what I have, which was part of my goal. Part of my goal was to work with them to do that. I guess I'd also think and hope that there's a lot of lives that I've touched with Eva's work. I don't know who they all are. I don't know what all of them are still doing. I think one regret I have is that I haven't been successful in getting trainers to carry on what I'm doing. That was one of the things I hoped to do, and I haven't gotten that done. I've got a couple of people now that are maybe close. I've got people that are teaching butterfly touch massage, but there's a whole lot more to Eva Reich's process than that. And one of my goals was, before I was done, is I would have somebody stepping in to carry it on, maybe in various parts of the world. That hasn't happened. It may still. I don't know how much longer I've got to teach. It's hard to tell. Maybe 20 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 4 years. It's kind of like at my age, one doesn't know what's going to happen. Things can shift quickly. So I would hope so much that maybe the book that's been written will help people to carry it on. Maybe some of the lives that I've touched will carry it on in whatever way it gets carried on for them as they're working with people. So I guess that when I thought about that question, that would maybe those are the most significant things.
That kind of takes us to another aspect of that question. Is there anything that you would change if you could go back?
Well, I thought about that, and a lot of people say, well, there's nothing to change because you really can't go back and change anything. But then I got to thinking again, there's a lot that I would change. There's a lot that's happened in my life that I would do differently. And I guess it's looking back on it that I can say that. I would hope, a lot of situations, I think I would have responded differently to the prejudicial stuff that I experienced. And that I would have been more outspoken, maybe, of supporting others. I think I would have changed my attitudes and the ingrained stuff about the roles of men and the roles of women. I would do that differently. I think there's some, knowing what I know now, I think I might have wished I could have been a better advocate for some of the kids in my school that were being picked on, that maybe I could have had the courage to stand up a little bit for them. So there's a lot of things. The relationships I was in, I think I might have liked to have ended them differently than I did, or maybe not gotten into them. And there's a lot I've learned along the way, and sometimes I've probably repeated the same mistakes. So knowing what I know now, there's a lot I would have done different. I might have gotten in a heck of a lot more trouble because I didn't know anything about sexuality when I was growing up. My dad's, that was something I would have liked to have a better grasp of. Is I don't know how much that was in my control, but I think I would have maybe asked more questions to get a better understanding, because no one ever told me anything about it from my family. I learned from a couple kids, and that's not very good information. My dad didn't tell me anything. He just said, if a woman lies under you, lie on top of her. It's just really a beautiful, wonderful experience. Well, that's true, but it's a heck of a lot more to it than that. As to how you get there and the responsibilities for it and so forth. There wasn't any concrete information. And he wasn't in a place of dealing with me to help me understand that. And my mother was in total denial. She wanted me, I think, to be asexual, not sexual. You weren't supposed to play kissing games. And however, like I said, if I would have known what I know now about sexuality, I might have gotten in a lot of trouble when I was younger. But I think I would have liked to have had that option rather than being like I was. So, yeah. So
as we near the end, to wrap it up, is there anything you'd like to add? Anything we haven't talked about, or remaining
it's
thoughts?
been a long, you've listened to me a lot. I'm not quite used to doing it this way. I'm used to people interacting and stopping and questioning more. But what I realize, there's been a lot that's happened in my life, and a lot of things that I've learned along the way. And a lot of people I've encountered I've been really privileged to meet the best people in the world. This group, I've got a chance to meet the people who care about other people. I've gotten to meet the people who want to help other people. And in all the countries I've gone into, that's been true. The work I've done has been kind of like a mission work. I've gone in places where people don't have a lot of money, but that's by choice. But I've also gotten to live in amongst the people. And in that process, I've gotten to learn a lot more about the individuals and the people and the cultures and what's going on. I've got to experience it, not as a tourist. I've gotten to see things tourists see, but I've got to experience what happens to the people, what they're going through. And I've met a lot of wonderful people that are caring about other people. So that's been one of the benefits. I remember sitting in Poland in Warsaw. There's a candy store there, ice cream store in downtown Warsaw that was bombed out in the war. And we were sitting there and I was eating something and I said to the person, if somebody would have told me in high school that I would be sitting in Warsaw at the age of whatever I was 70 or 70, maybe around 70, I would have said, no way. And here I was sitting in Warsaw in a building that had been blown apart. Only a third of it had been left. Famous candy, Guiders, I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, that was a surprise. I never would have expected to be there. I would have said, no way. So, been a lot of changes, a lot of transitions. Maybe one of the things that came out of my conception and birth was I learned to struggle to survive. That my sister had said to me, you've gone down so much, but you've always bounced back up. And I learned to do a lot alone and to get through that. And there's good and bad in that because it can be a lonely process. But I do know how to survive alone. And that may be one of the good things that came out of that. I've learned how to survive on a little. And my little is a whole lot more than a lot of other people have in the world. My little is a relationship to where I live. But, yeah, that part I wouldn't change, I guess.